friends, thanks so much for tuning into the Speaking of Equity podcast leadership series. Really special thanks to Mayor Ethan Baker, Christine DiPilato, Dr. Aaron Detmer, Dr. David Recker, Principal Shari Paulus, and Principal Ryan Brinks for joining us and unpacking their thinking about equity. We really appreciate their time and their ability to be vulnerable and share their thoughts with the community. And if you have any desire to revisit some of those episodes, feel free to stop by and check out TSD World Class Podcast wherever you listen to podcasts, and check us out on YouTube at the TSD YouTube channel as well. Thanks a lot. Hello, friends. Welcome to the Speaking of Equity podcast, where every conversation about education is a conversation about equity. I'm your host, Cornelius Godfrey, and I am pleased to be joined with our distinguished guest, Miss Christine DiPilato. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Cornelius. Happy to be here.
Yeah, so you happen to be a member of a very elite club, and that's TSD employees with the first name Christine.
Yes, there's a lot of us.
Yeah, you guys have a little bit of a Christine cabal going. So whatever you plan, I hope, I'm favorably considered, though I'm not a Christine. You all hold a lot of power in that group.
Well, we'll partner right up with you, Cornelius. You got a C to start your name, so it all works out.
That's right. So listen, one of our goals here is to kind of expose the thinking of our leaders in this Speaking of Equity Leaders series, so that people get an understanding of how the conversation of equity is being framed, not necessarily in the policy world, but in the thinking and in the personal approach, so that as we start to begin making changes and advancements and improvements, people know the thinking of those who are driving those changes. Does that make sense?
It does. Yes, it does.
Okay, good. So as we're thinking about the conversation of equity, and all of us have, different places of entry, right? All of us come to this conversation with a different lens, with a different background, with a different motivation. My question for you is, what's your why? How are you primarily motivated to pursue this in your world?
So when I think about equity, Cornelius, I think about, part of what I reflect on is how we all benefit from a community in which we all feel like we belong, right? So when we think about, in my educational lens, we know that children don't learn best unless they're seen for who they are and what they bring to the table. So my why behind equity is, how do we continue to engage our students for all of who they are, and the adults in our community and see them for all of who they are, in order to enrich and create the strongest community we can here in Troy and really in any community around us.
Yeah, and that's such an important part of building that sense of community too, is feeling like there's a place for you. And I love this idea of belonging, right? And I've been sharing to others that this idea of belonging versus fitting in has really resonated with me, in that, belonging means not only have I developed a sense of who I am and my identity, but that identity is being not just accepted, but even celebrated in those places where belonging really exists, versus fitting in, which is just, me doing what I can to blend in with what everyone else is doing, so that my identity kind of fades into the background.
Right. Being honored and being noticed and also being missed, right? I think so many of us as adults in teams or in communities, when we aren't present and people don't notice that we're not present, it makes you feel less like you're a part of the whole. And it's the same thing for our kiddos in the classroom. Our students who, when they're missing for a day and maybe we don't check in on them on that day, I think that also sends a message. So I agree with what you're saying.
Yeah, great observation. And it really kind of hits at this idea of knowing me for who I am and being invested in my own growth and understanding of who I am, especially as our young people are stepping into their own identities. So what I wonder is, At what point did you become most aware or grow in your awareness of your own identity and the ways that you identify?
So, I thought of that. I think of that question a little bit in two different ways. Probably my earliest noticing of race and just that not everyone looked like me was in elementary school. And I was in a parochial school, a small parochial school, and a boy joined our class. His name was Fame, and he was the only Black boy who was in our school. And so when he came to our class, he was a student who I'd never gone to school with a Black student before. And so that piqued my awareness of difference, but only just a physical difference, right? There wasn't a whole lot at that small school. There wasn't a whole lot of discussion that happened around race and racial identity. And so then I also thought of that question in the way of when did I really become aware of my racial identity and what that might carry, right? Like who I am and what I bring to the table. And I'll tell you, it takes me back to 1996, Troy High School. I'll give a shout out to Troy High School and two legends of my high school experience, Linda Pavich and Donna Guth, who are two incredible teachers in the English department at Troy High School. I was in the AP English class my senior year, and we read The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. And when I read this book, it was the first time in my life I really realized or started grappling with the thinking of, we all are born with different things. We look differently when we're born, and how society places value on what you bring, you don't control as a human being who brings that to the table. So what you look like when you are born to this world and what society has already decided they value, the conflict in that, in my head as a 16-year-old, as I was working through that idea that Pecola Breedlove in The Bluest Eye and her, her obsession with Mary Jane candies and her obsession with the Mary Jane doll and her needing to be that in order to be valued in her community was heartbreaking for me. And I had never in my life up until then really understood that maybe there were people out there who felt that way. Because to me, I was never let to be felt that way, right? Like I didn't grow up in a scenario where I ever felt that I couldn't belong because of what society dictated. And so that experience opened my eyes. And I also think that was really what drove me as a person to be fascinated with the doors that can be opened through literature, the doors and the windows, and, really kind of set my trajectory to become a high school English teacher, because I really believed that was life-changing for me. And then, tried to provide some of those same opportunities for kids when I was educating.
Wow. So much there, right? Like the way your understanding traveled through this avenue of literacy really affirms that this is an important opportunity for us as educators to advance the thinking of our youngest learners. But then also, like, thinking about that book specifically, allowing your lens to be adjusted to the world of young Pecola and this thinking that these levels of difference, especially for Black and brown children and for children who, embody some identity that's different from majority society, that those thinkings happen so early. They happen so young. My own children, we've already had, so many conversations about their brown skin and the world that they live in. And this idea that we as parents now, while we're also navigating the same world of complex nuance and differences and how society views, how even the conversation can be had. How are you navigating as a parent this job of being able to shepherd children through an experience that sometimes we as an adults are still working to process. And in what ways do you suspect your journey as a parent has been different from your own parents, who I would imagine did not have some of these same deep conversations?
Sure. Well, so I have two little ones, Cornelius. I've got a little girl, Stella, she's 6, and then a little boy, Leo, he's 9. So we're really in the throes of it with these, young, formative conversations. So 1st grade and 4th grade. And I think that, one of the experiences that I actually had this past summer, so summer of 2020 with my 2 children, we were in the car and we were driving through our neighborhood, and one of our neighbors had recently put, so we had, there's a variety of political signs up, obviously, with 2020 going on. One of our neighbors put up a very large homemade sign that they had spray painted out on the front that was a Black Lives Matter sign that they put up. One side said Black Lives Matter, and then the other side said silence is violence. So that's what they had put up in their yard. And my children saw the white board go up before it was painted. So it became a big piece of interest for them, right? To be able to see, what is this art that's going up? What is it going to look like? So it was painted, and we were driving by it after it had been painted. And my son, my 4th grader, he said, Black Lives Matter. He read it for Stella, Black Lives Matter. And then Stella stops and looks at Leo, and Leo says, so Mom, did they not matter before? And I'm driving. And so I paused and I said to him, there's a lot to unpack there, right? Because that statement, he read exactly what it means, right? That they haven't been valued. They haven't been. And if they mattered, why would you have to have a movement, right? And why would you have to make a sign in your front porch or on your front lawn that said that? And so that allowed us, that opened the door for a lot of dialogue around what is happening in our community, what is happening in our world, what has happened in the past. And they've had some historical perspective as provided in elementary school around Martin Luther King Day, around very basic understandings of civil rights movement, but not anything that would carry them from that point in history to now. And so, their understanding in their minds was it was addressed and it was dealt with then, and everything should be fine now because we were told in school that these rules were changed. And so now we all have equal access, right? Everybody can, and they'll point to it. Everybody can drink from the same drinking fountain. Everybody's in the same classroom in school. Right. And, some of our community might say the same thing. But so for this to be there on that front lawn was really, a challenge in their understanding of where we were as a society, and gave us an opportunity to have that dialogue and to continue to dig in. But there aren't easy answers, right? Those are difficult and challenging conversations. And, part of your question was also thinking about our own parents, right? And I think about my parents who, they didn't shy away from hard conversations. They certainly provided us with an opportunity to ask questions. I was never embarrassed or worried that we couldn't talk about race in our house. But I believe that one of the major differences is an understanding of privilege, which I don't believe existed is probably the wrong word, but I don't believe it was as prevalent of a dialogue or conversation 40 years ago as it is now. And I don't think that there was a lot of thought around white privilege. I don't think there was a lot of thought around, being in a society that is, that I think there was a lot of benefit. There clearly is a lot of benefit to white privilege. So I don't think there was a lot of questioning of it. And so a lot of our dialogue growing up was from my parents' experience in the civil rights movement and being able to have dialogue around that, but never a checking of our own privilege, and certainly not an introduction of mine to me. And I think that's a big part of the conversation. And that's like part of the conversation that we are openly having with our children. Dan and I, when we talk about, we talk to Leo about who he is, how he shows up and what he brings to the table and how he needs to be aware of that. And as he gets older, there's more of it to unpack. And, the same Stella listens to those conversations, but, I think that's probably a much different scenario as a parent than what my parents had when I was growing up.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love it. I love that young Leo is growing up able to embrace the whole of his identity without any associated shame or guilt, because this is just the world as it's been handed to him. And now how empowering is it that you're able to position him to think about what he can do in, his world, in his sphere of influence, to leverage some of those, privileges that you're sharing with him, that he's learning about, so that he sees himself with a degree of agency. I think that's one of the most troubling things about going through some parts of this journey as a member of majority culture, because so much of this is difficult and because it's been so taboo and unaddressed by education and families, that people come to these awarenesses often with a sense of powerlessness and a often defeated type of attitude, because it does not seem or isn't always apparent that there are moves that can be made. But I love that that's something that you're handing to your children. So, kudos to you.
We're trying. We're starting it.
Good. And this question of identity, as we dig deeper, really makes me wonder how you have been able to process personally the different identity markers that you have and how they have either hindered or benefited your journey toward seeing yourself as a part of a larger equity advancing mechanism, or how has that affected your ability to recognize the place or part you might play in advancing equity in your world?
I think that's a great question. And, Cornelius, when I think about the world, the way I grew up in the world, and what I brought to the table and where I lived and where I went to school and what I chose to study and who I chose to surround myself with. And I think that all of those pieces probably hindered my understanding of equity for a very long time. When I think about my experiences in even in college and in graduate school, studying as an educator, but going to Northwestern University and then going to Harvard, I was very much in a world that was
slight flex
exclusive and not super diverse, mm-hmm. and not inclusionary. I mean, certainly, maybe a little bit diverse, but not inclusionary when we think about all of those components. And, I had pride in that, right? In going to these selective experiences. But I also didn't have a balance for what else was out there. Mm-hmm. And so leaving and growing up, I think becoming an adult and living outside of the academia, like outside of the academic world, in the real world, and then teaching children in schools, you really start to see what else is out there. Not that I was blind to what else was out there, because you do a whole lot of studying in academia around equity and inclusion. You do a whole lot of studying around the achievement gap. You do a whole lot of talking about looking at opportunities and the opportunity gap versus the achievement gap. And we talk through all of these things, right? There's a lot of language that we put around all of these challenges.
Right.
But knowing the language and knowing the data and knowing the process for how to fix it, because you've been told and taught how to fix it, doesn't mean you can go into a community and engage and do the work, right? They don't teach you in any of these schools how how they don't give you a community to walk into. We talk about building community, but you have to go and do that work. Mm-hmm. And so I think that for me, coming from a place of privilege and not recognizing it right away, just because it was the place I came from, then recognizing it and then owning that and figuring out where I need to go next. I think in full transparency, that's been a journey, right? And a journey that maybe I'm embarrassed took so long in some ways. But at the same time, feeling like, going through that journey, having children of my own, living life a little bit differently allows us to, see what's out there and start to understand all of these academic ideas. They're not as clean and neat as we would all like them to be. They have to be fit for each one of our communities based on what our communities need. And that's exactly what our teachers experience every day in the classroom. When we come with all these strategies on how to engage and how to do deep learning and how to, all of those sound nice and they look really nice in the workbook, but how we get them to actually work in our classrooms, that takes the seasoning that our teachers have. That takes the expertise that they have through experience. And that's exactly how I feel about this work that we're doing around equity. It is messy and it is dirty because we have to get in there and fail forward as quickly as we can. Mm-hmm. And so, I think that's a little bit about, where I am right now.
And beautifully said. And I really connect with and appreciate, your acknowledgement that there's a philosophical, very ethereal side to conversations. But then there's also the practical and how driven are some of those philosophies when the rubber meets the road by actual relationships and developing connections. Because ultimately, we're not talking about systems as so much as we are people who are a part of systems. And definitely systems have to change. But as those systems change, we are also depending on people to uphold and really live out the values we embed in those systems. So really thinking about what disconnects actually exist between our understandings in the philosophical and academic senses versus what connections and roots have we dug into in terms of relationships in our communities. And this brings me to, our last thought, and I thank you for your patience. This is awesome conversation that I'm so glad other people are able to take part of. But as we're moving forward in advancing equity and inclusion in Troy, and really thinking about how can we bring as many voices to the table, invariably there will be people who feel somewhat disconnected from the work of equity and really struggling to see the relevance to their own experience and maybe even the relevance inside the larger community. For example, many people point to the statistical diversity that exists in our district and our community. And at times, I believe that's seen as a means of promoting this as an egalitarian community that does not necessarily have any challenges in the world of equity and inclusion. Help me to know what postures you adopt when you position equity as a worthwhile endeavor for those who are really struggling philosophically to see its value. And how do you hold space for dialogue so that those individuals who are struggling to connect with this relevance are able to feel engaged and honored?
It's a great question, Cornelius. And I think, when I think about the work that we have ahead of us and the work that we are passionate about when it comes to equity and inclusion, I think about the voices of our students. So I would offer and welcome those who might be struggling with the why of our work to listen to the voices of our students. And I know that one of the things that we are dedicated to doing is raising those voices. And if you're not able to hear those voices and you want to hear more of them, reach out to us so that we can provide that platform. But if we listen to our students' voices and we look at the data that we have, and right now, most of the data we have is achievement-based data, and that might not be the best data. And we're dedicated to collecting some more and some better data when it comes to inclusion and community work that we're doing. But even if we look at our achievement data, our enrollment data, and our discipline data, and then we listen to the student voices again. So listen to the voices, look at the data, listen to the voices. And then I would offer, what do you see and what do you hear? So I don't need to tell you what I see and what I hear, but I'd love to hear what you see and what you hear when you look at the data and hear those voices. And I think that is what drives us, and that is what should continue to drive us. Our work, whether it be in the classroom with formal instruction or whether it be with this work around equity, if our students can't share with us that there's a difference, then there isn't a difference. And those are the voices that matter most. And so I think, if we can surround ourselves with student voices, we will know if we are doing the right work.
Yep, they are our indicators. They're the ones who determine whether we've been successful. Thank you so much for that answer. I am really encouraged that after having heard, your thoughts and your heart on the matter, there are probably likely a lot of people who would love to connect with you and to support the work that you're doing. As we close, please share with us, how can people best do that? How can they support and connect?
Thanks, Cornelius. Yeah, absolutely. Anytime. Email is a great way to get a hold of me. And I'd love to come visit. So if you have a classroom that you'd like me to come visit, please invite me. I'm still new to Troy and getting to know our different classrooms. And even if it's a K-5 classroom, I'd love to come and visit you during your prep or with your students there. But reach out anytime via email, via phone would be wonderful.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Christine.
Thanks, Cornelius.